The air smelled like iron and damp brick, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. South Philly wasn't loud that night. It rarely needed to be. The quiet held more power than noise, especially on the narrow streets where the old row houses leaned in like they were eavesdropping. George Borgesi had always walked like he belonged to the shadows. He wasn't the biggest guy in the crew, not by a long shot. But there was a strange stillness about him that made people pause before speaking too fast. He was born into it, really. Into a world where uncles were soldiers and fathers knew too many names whispered in parking lots. The Borgesi name carried weight, not heavy like a burden, heavy like a pistol resting on a table no one dared to touch. He had that walk even as a kid, slow, knowing, like he already understood the kind of man he'd become. At 12, he knew where bodies had been buried, not the literal ones, not yet. But reputations, alliances, debts, those were just as dead and just as dangerous. Back then, the 1980s smelled like gasoline and gunmetal. The Philly mob was going through one of its bloodiest chapters. Scarfo was still casting long, vicious shadows, and George, young, watchful, underestimated, was learning where the fear lived. He studied men like others studied scripture, who got respected, who got stepped on, who disappeared and why. His mother lit candles in the kitchen for saints who probably wouldn't show up. His father sat with coffee that never cooled and stared at nothing. The streets whispered to George louder than any prayer ever could. There were rules here, real ones. And you didn't need a priest to know when you'd broken them. By the time he was in his early 20s, George wasn't just listening anymore. He was speaking, quietly, efficiently, through actions more than words. His uncle, Joseph Uncle Joe Ligambi, had already taken note. There were things you couldn't teach, a feel for tension in the room, an ear for lies wrapped in silk. George had that. But it wasn't ambition that drove him. Not exactly. Ambition is noisy. George was quieter than that. He moved like a man searching for silence in a world that never gave it. In rooms filled with cigar smoke and low murmurs, his presence had a gravity to it. Not arrogance, just certainty. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to be. They started giving him small jobs, bookmaking, collections, low-level enforcement. He never overplayed his hand, never talked too much. In a family where loyalty was often just the space between bullets, George became something different, dependable. There was a saying among the older guys, sleep is for the safe or the stupid. George never slept too long, just enough to stay human, not enough to get comfortable. He knew better. He'd seen too many guys start snoring and wake up in the trunk of a Buick. The neighborhood never really changed, just got older, more tired. But the eyes watching from behind curtains stayed the same, measuring, judging, protecting. George didn't smile much. He didn't have to. His silence filled in all the gaps. And yet, even for a man like him, there were cracks that only the dark could see. He kept a journal, if you can believe it. Not the kind with pages of guilt and grief. Just names. Patterns. Days when someone was late on a payment. Nights when a cousin from the old country said something that didn't sit right. It wasn't evidence. It was memory, sharpened. He once wrote, "The ones who smile too wide always want something they're too scared to earn." George never smiled too wide. Mornings in South Philly were different from the rest of the city. They didn't start with sunlight and birdsong. No, they started with the metal clank of rolling gates on corner stores, the hiss of a bus brake at the stop on Oregon Avenue, and the slow, careful scraping of old men sweeping the sidewalks in front of row homes built before their fathers were born. There was something sacred in those routines, something that said, "We're still here." Even when the headlines screamed about indictments, wiretaps, or who got found face down in the squeal kill, the streets kept moving, quietly, like they'd seen too much to flinch anymore. George Borgesi stood on the stoop of his mother's house that morning, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, the kind with a little gold trim and a faded Atlantic City logo that had probably come from a boardwalk shop 20 years ago. His breath clouded in the late winter air. It was cold, but not sharp, just cold enough to keep people honest. He didn't wear anything flashy, no gold chains, No silk shirts with the top 3 buttons undone. That wasn't him. That was for guys who wanted to look like they were in the life, not the ones who actually were. George dressed like someone who could fix your furnace or break your fingers, depending on how the conversation went. That morning, a Lincoln Continental pulled up slow. Black, clean, tinted windows. It didn't honk, didn't flash its lights, just stopped, like it had been summoned by thought alone. George took one more sip and walked down the steps. Inside the car, his cousin Vin sat behind the wheel. He had a face like a worn leather wallet, folded in places, dark around the eyes, always holding something you couldn't quite see. "You sleep last night?" Vin asked, not looking over. "Enough," George said, sliding in. They didn't say much after that, didn't need to. The ride was its own kind of conversation. The tires hummed over cracked asphalt. The heater rattled. Outside, South Philly passed by in soft blurs, corner delis, brick walls painted with fading murals, and kids kicking frozen soda cans down alleys where secrets still clung to the walls like graffiti. They were headed to Dante's. Now, if you were from Philly, you probably thought Dante's was just another Italian cafe with too much chrome and not enough espresso. But to the right people, Dante's was where deals were cooked long before they reached the streets. Back tables, quiet corners. The kind of place where you didn't raise your voice unless you were lying. Today, it was about numbers. Collections were down in South Jersey. A couple of young guys running the sports betting action were getting sloppy, taking on degenerates with no money and worse luck. That kind of thing reflected bad on the Borgesi name. George didn't like that. Inside Dante's, the warmth wrapped around you like a wool coat. Thick, heavy, just a little uncomfortable. The walls were yellowed from years of cigarette smoke, even though the ashtrays had disappeared sometime in the late 90s when everyone pretended the mob had vanished with them. They slid into a booth near the back. Nobody asked what they wanted. 2 cups of coffee just showed up. Black, strong, and burned like it had been sitting on the hot plate since sunrise. Across from them sat little Sal. Little Sal wasn't little. He was 30 pounds too heavy, wore tracksuits like they were a birthright, and always smelled like too much cologne and not enough deodorant. He had a way of talking that made your skin itch. Fast, jumpy, with eyes that didn't settle on anything for too long. Guys like him didn't last, but sometimes they stuck around longer than you'd expect, like a leak in a pipe nobody could find. "George," Sal said with a smile too wide, "heard you were coming by." "You didn't have to." "I did," George said. Just that. Quiet, flat. Enough to drain the smile off Sal's face like a flicked light switch. Vin didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Sal licked his lips, rubbed his hands together. "I mean, yeah, I know collections are down," he said, suddenly all nerves. "But these guys, they're good for it. They just had a rough couple of..." "You vouching for them?" George asked. Sal paused, just long enough for everyone to hear it. I mean, not like vouch, because if you are," George said, leaning in, "then their debt's your debt. That what you want?" Sal shook his head fast. No, not like that. I'll talk to them. I'll tighten it up." George sipped his coffee, set it down, let the silence stretch out long enough to make Sal sweat. "You got a week," George said. "Then we're done talking." Sal nodded too quickly. "Got it. Absolutely. A week, not a day more." George stood, slid out of the booth, and walked out without looking back. Vin followed a step behind. Outside, the cold hit harder now. The sun had started its slow rise, turning the tops of the buildings gold while the streets stayed gray. They didn't say much on the ride back. Vin finally broke the quiet. "You think he gets it?" he asked. George stared out the window, watching the city roll past like an old film. "He doesn't have to get it," George said. "He just has to obey." Later that evening, back at his apartment, a simple place above a tailor shop on Passyunk, George sat by the window, lights off, nursing a glass of whiskey. The world outside moved in slow silence. A couple argued in Spanish down the block. Somewhere, a dog barked, tired and angry. The hum of life continued like a record stuck on one scratch. He liked it that way. Quiet, predictable. But there was something else on his mind that night. A letter had come, slipped under the door like a whisper. No return address, no envelope, just a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. The handwriting was careful, old school, Pen to paper, none of that typed anonymous nonsense. Someone wanted to be taken seriously. You know what happened to Frankie wasn't an accident. You're next if you're not careful. That was all it said. Frankie. Frankie Soft Hands Conti, a guy who'd gone missing 3 weeks ago. Rumor had it he'd been skimming off the top of a numbers game out in Delaware County. They said he took off, moved to Arizona. George didn't buy it. Guys like Frankie didn't run. They made jokes, made excuses, made mistakes, but they didn't run. George stared at the letter, folded it once, then again, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. See, Frankie wasn't just some associate. He'd been with George since the beginning, since they were teenagers stealing hubcaps and selling fake IDs to high school kids. He knew things, too many things. And now, he was gone, without a body, without a trace. And someone wanted George to know it wasn't over. He didn't sleep that night, not because he was afraid. George didn't scare easy, but because there was movement now, in the shadows, behind the curtains. The kind of movement that meant someone was playing a game, and George hated games he didn't know the rules to. He sat by the window, watching the darkness shift, listening to the city breathe. And in that breath, he heard something familiar, the slow, inevitable approach of betrayal. Sleep came in pieces now. George didn't lie down like regular people. He sat in the same chair near the window, the one with a small rip on the left armrest, the leather worn soft from years of late-night thinking. His eyes would close for 10, maybe 15 minutes at a time, like a soldier catching rest between artillery shells. Not real sleep, just retreat. The letter hadn't left his mind. Frankie Conti's name lingered like smoke after a fire, and whoever left that warning under his door had known exactly what they were doing. The message wasn't a threat. It was a confession, a quiet little ghost stepping into George's apartment and whispering, "You're next." But George wasn't the kind of man to panic. He didn't call anyone. Didn't rant or make accusations. He observed. That was his strength. While other men reached for guns, George reached for silence. And silence, when used right, could kill louder than bullets. At 7:03 a.m., George finally stood, stretched his back and walked to the sink. The apartment was dead quiet except for the pipes clinking in the walls, that old Philadelphia sound. He splashed water on his face, slow, like he was easing back into his own skin. Then he opened a small drawer beneath the toaster. Not for a gun, for a notebook. The same one he'd been keeping since he was 20. Leather-bound, no labels, nothing flashy. Just handwritten pages in neat, steady script, observations, suspicions, timelines. He believed in memory, but memory faded. Ink didn't. He flipped back to the page he'd marked with a red tab. Frankie Conti, January 12th, met at Rocco's, seemed nervous, mentioned pressure from someone outside, said he didn't trust the young ones. George underlined it again, slowly. Frankie hadn't been wrong. Something had been shifting in the air for months now. Small things. Looked like nothing to the untrained eye. Late payments, missed meetings, too much chatter from the young guys who were supposed to just take orders, not question them. That was the problem with the new generation. They watched too many movies, thought every move had to be loud, flashy. Power for them was about who looked the scariest, not who controlled the silence. George zipped up his jacket and headed out. The streets were still wet from a light morning rain, the kind that soaked into the bricks and made everything smell like damp rust. South Philly in the winter had a kind of quiet loneliness to it. The old-timers on their stoops were gone. The corner boys were still asleep. Only the serious people were out now. Bakers, butchers, gangsters. He walked not far. 2 blocks east, down a narrow alley behind a mechanic's shop. There was a side door there, no label, no sign, just a dull gray panel and a buzzer that didn't buzz. George knocked 3 times, short, long. The door opened. Inside stood Carlo Magliano, 65 years old, bald as a cue ball, with a limp from a car bomb that didn't quite do its job back in '92. Carlo had been around longer than anyone, a consigliere without the title, not because he wasn't respected, but because he preferred the shadows. Titles made you a target. Carlo preferred being a rumor. "You look like shit," Carlo said, letting George in. "I've slept less," George replied. Carlo gestured toward the small table in the corner of the room. It was bare except for 2 mugs and a black rotary phone that never rang unless something was wrong. George sat. He didn't waste time. "Someone left me a message, no name. Said Frankie didn't disappear. Said I'm next." Carlo didn't blink, just poured coffee into both mugs. "You think it's real?" George nodded. "Yeah. Whoever wrote it, they knew things. Things I didn't even tell Vin." Carlo sipped. "Then you got a leak." George said nothing. Carlo tapped his mug, thoughtful. "Could be a setup. Could be a test. Maybe someone wants to see if you rattle." "Then they're not watching close enough," George said. Carlo grinned, but it didn't touch his eyes. "You know what I always liked about you, George? You never flinch. Even when you should." George leaned back, watching the steam rise from his coffee. "I need names." Carlo nodded slowly. "I'll dig. Quietly. But you? You need to keep moving like nothing happened. The minute they know you're looking, they'll start hiding. Let them think you're still asleep." Later that afternoon, George made an appearance at the barbershop. Tony the Blades on South 9th was less about haircuts and more about conversation. Nothing important ever started there, but everything passed through eventually. Information moved like smoke, thick, invisible, and dangerous to breathe in too deep. Tony looked up from his chair as George walked in. "You trimming the beard today or just checking on the weather?" "Trim. Light," George said. Tony waved him over and draped the apron around his neck. A few old men sat along the wall reading newspapers they didn't care about. A kid swept hair into a lazy pile. The TV overhead played a muted news report, some politician promising change in a city that never changed. Tony snipped quietly for a while before speaking. "You hear about Nicky?" George kept his eyes on the mirror. "What about him?" "Word is he's been meeting with some out-of-towners, not the usual crowd. Younger, jersey plates, flashy shoes." George raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Tony leaned in a little. "And he's been talking about you, real casual-like. Said you were too old school, that things were evolving." George exhaled slow. Not a sigh. Just a release. Nicky Russo, mid-30s, smart enough to survive, dumb enough to think survival meant climbing over corpses. He'd been around 6, maybe 7 years. Always respectful to George's face, but behind it, that was different. George paid, tipped the kid sweeping, and stepped out into the cold. Now the lines were forming. Someone inside the family had their eyes on his seat. Someone thought George was slipping. And if Frankie had known something, had maybe even warned George before he vanished, then this wasn't random. It was a move, calculated, slow, like rot under the floorboards. But George didn't run from rot. He dug it out. That night, he made one call. To Vin. No explanation, just a time and place. Where 2 hours later, they sat in a parked car outside an abandoned warehouse off the docks. The windows fogged slightly. George lit a cigarette, a rare habit only for moments when the dark pressed in too close. "I need to know something," George said, without looking over. "Anything Nicky's said. Done. People he's met. Who he's paid. Who he hasn't." Vin shifted in his seat. "You think he's coming for you?" George flicked ash out the cracked window. "I think he already did. I just didn't see the blade yet." Vin nodded. "Then we move." "Not yet," George said. Vin frowned. "Why not?" George turned toward him finally, his eyes calm, cold. "Because I don't want to shoot him maybe. I want to bury it definitely." The next few days were a return to rhythm. Appearances, walks, laughs at the right jokes. George moved like nothing was wrong. He visited the deli on Federal Street, took his godson to the park, showed up at Sunday dinner with a bottle of red wine and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But inside, the machine was turning. He had Vin watching Nicky. Carlo making quiet calls to guys who owed him favors from another life. Even Sal, twitchy, wide-eyed Sal, had been given tasks and George was watching how he handled them. You learned a lot from how a man handled pressure. especially when he didn't know he was being tested. And every night, George returned to the window, to the chair, to the silence. He hadn't burned the letter, he kept it, pressed flat between the pages of his notebook, like a dead leaf. Because that was what it really was. The first fallen leaf before winter. A warning. A promise. And George Borgesi, born of these streets, shaped by silence and shadows, knew one thing better than most. Winter in South Philly didn't kill quick. It killed slow, quiet, icy, and always from the inside out. Rain hit South Philly like a whisper that never stopped. It didn't roar. It just kept falling, soft and endless, like the sky was tired of holding its secrets. The kind of rain that made men walk slower, think longer. It slicked the brick alleyways, darkened the stoops, and softened the sharp corners of a city that didn't like being softened. George Borgesi sat in his car outside the St. Agnes Social Club, fingers tapping the steering wheel to a rhythm only he could hear. He wasn't going inside yet. The place looked normal. 3 steps up to a frosted glass door, a faded awning overhead, lights glowing soft and gold through drawn curtains. To anyone else, it was just another South Philly hangout for old men and middle-aged guys playing cards and arguing about football. But to George, this club was something else. It was a test. Word on the street, filtered through Tony the Blade, backed up by Carlo, was that Nicky Russo had taken a seat at the poker table in the back room every Tuesday night for the last 3 weeks. And each time, a different out-of-town face showed up and left with a handshake. George didn't play cards anymore. Not because he was bad at it, he wasn't, but because cards were too slow for the stakes he was dealing with now. He didn't bluff anymore. He hunted. And tonight, he wasn't hunting money. He finally stepped out of the car, slow and deliberate, let the rain hit his shoulders and soak into his wool coat. No umbrella, no rush. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him like an old coat. Cigarette smoke lingered in the air, even though the signs on the wall said not to. The bartender nodded at him. No smile, just respect. George gave a slight nod back. Then he walked through the front room, past the low laughter and the clink of whiskey glasses, and stopped outside the back room door. He didn't knock. He walked in. 6 men sat around the table. A half-empty bottle of bourbon sat at the center. Cash in sloppy piles, cards in motion. Nicky Russo looked up mid-deal, and for half a second, less maybe, his eyes widened. Then it was gone. "Georgie," Nicky said, leaning back with a practiced smile. "Didn't think you liked poker anymore." "I don't," George said, pulling up a chair. He didn't ask if it was okay. He didn't care. Nicky licked his lips and glanced at the others. 2 were Philly guys. George knew their names, their vices, their debts. The other 3 were strangers. That bothered him. Nicky reached for the bottle. "Drink?" George shook his head. The silence around the table thickened. He looked at the out-of-towners one by one. Young, flashy watches, soft hands, not killers, not yet, but maybe scouts, maybe whispers of something bigger. George folded his arms. "I hear you've been busy," he said to Nicky. Nicky shrugged. "Trying to grow. You know how it is. The old ways ain't working like they used to." "Is that right?" Nicky's smile twitched. "No offense, I'm just saying, the world's changing." George leaned forward, his voice low. "It changes when I say it does." The table went still. One of the outsiders, and the one with the gold watch and 2 clean sneakers, shifted in his seat. George turned to him. "You got a name?" The kid blinked. "Jason." "Just Jason?" He hesitated. "Jason Merlino." George nodded like he'd remember it. He wouldn't, because the kid wouldn't matter after tonight. He turned back to Nicky. "You bring outsiders into this city, you clear it. That's the rule." "I did," Nicky said, a little too quick. "I ran it past Vin." George's eyes narrowed. Now that was interesting. Vin, his cousin, his blood, the one he'd trusted to run point on surveillance, the one he hadn't seen in 3 days. He stood up, slow. "Enjoy your cards," he said. Then he left, not fast, not angry, just calm. but the kind of calm that meant a storm was building behind his eyes. The rain followed him home. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, needed the steps, needed the rhythm. When he got inside, he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, sat at the table, and opened the notebook again. This time, he didn't write. He just stared at the last entry. Vin watching Nikki, Feb 5th. No contact since Feb 8th. That was 3 days ago. George didn't like gaps, not in stories, not in timelines, especially not with people who mattered. He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. Carlo answered on the 3rd ring. "You hear anything from Vin?" "Not a word," Carlo said, voice dry. "Why?" "Because Nikki says he cleared those Jersey kids with him." A pause. Then Carlo cursed under his breath. "You think? I think someone's making moves behind my back. You want me to find him?" George was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I'll find him myself." The next morning, George drove out to Vin's last known apartment, a small place above a pawn shop in Bella Vista. Not fancy, just quiet. The kind of place a man stayed when he didn't want to be remembered. The landlord didn't ask questions. Just took the folded 20 and handed over the spare key with a shrug. The apartment smelled faintly of cologne and dust. Nothing out of place. Bed made, dishes in the sink. But the trash hadn't been taken out and there was mold on the bread. That wasn't Vin. He was a mess in other ways. Loud music, bad jokes, fast women, but not in this way. He was present, grounded. This room felt abandoned. George walked to the nightstand, opened the drawer. Inside was a folded photo, an old one. George and Vin at some cookout years back when everything felt untouchable. The kind of picture you didn't keep around unless you were remembering something lost. Then he found it. A burner phone, wrapped in a sock, taped to the back of the drawer. George flipped it open. No passcode, only 2 messages, both from the same number. "He's getting too close. We move this week. If you're in, meet me at the storage unit. Code 4019. The date was from 2 nights ago. George felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic, just clarity. Vin had been playing a dangerous game, maybe double-crossing, maybe spying for his own gain. But either way, he hadn't come back. And that meant only one thing. The walls were closing in. That night, George didn't go home. He drove, out past the edge of the city where the skyline faded and the streetlights grew farther apart. He didn't bring backup, didn't tell Carlo. This part was personal. The storage unit was out in Tinicum, near the airport, near the water, the kind of place where bodies went missing for good. He entered the code. 419. The door rolled up with a metal groan. Inside was darkness and something else, something still. Then a flicker. Light bulb overhead. George stepped inside. And there, against the wall, tied to a chair, bloodied but breathing, was Vin. His face was a mess, lip split, eye swollen, one arm twisted at a bad angle, but he was alive. George stepped closer. Vin blinked up at him, coughed once. "I didn't sell you out," he said, voice cracked and raw. "I swear to God, Georgie, I was trying to stop them." George crouched in front of him. "Who?" Vin shook his head. "I don't know them all, just pieces." "Nikki?" "Yeah, but there's someone above him, someone out of state. They're trying to take it all. South Philly, the unions, the docks. Said you were too stagnant, said you were sleeping." George's jaw clenched. Vin coughed again. "I followed one of them, got jumped, been here 2 days. Thought maybe you wouldn't come." George stood slowly. "Then you don't know me at all." The warehouse smelled like rust and gasoline, the kind of place where silence had weight and time moved slower. George stood still in the middle of it. The metal door rolled shut behind him, the flickering bulb above throwing long shadows across the concrete floor. Vin was slumped in the chair, blood drying along the side of his face, lips cracked, one eye sealed shut. But he was alive. That was more than George expected. "You look like hell," George muttered, his voice low and level. Vin managed a weak grin. And you look like someone who just woke up too late. George crouched beside him, careful not to touch him just yet. His hands weren't for comfort right now. They were still stiff from gripping the steering wheel too hard on the way over. He didn't like what he was feeling, not anger. Worse, something cold, a numbness creeping in like frost through an open window. Vin's voice was hoarse. They knew I was watching them. I wasn't careful enough. Who hit you? Vin coughed. Don't know all their names. A couple of Jersey kids I've seen hanging around Nicky. One of them had a tattoo on his neck, the old Trenton Cruise mark. Red crown, black dagger, used to mean something in the 90s, but now it's just muscle. These guys were rough but not smart. They were following orders. George's jaw tightened. Nicky? Vin shook his head. He didn't do the hitting, but he knew. I heard them talking before I blacked out. Nicky was supposed to come by yesterday, check if I cracked. He never showed. George stood, paced a slow circle around the chair. The gears in his head were turning, but he didn't rush them. That was what separated men like him from the amateurs. Amateurs reacted. Men like George, they processed. So far, it all made a cruel kind of sense. Nicky Russo, cocky, reckless, eager for a piece bigger than his bite, had made a deal. Not with another crew in Philly. That wouldn't be bold enough. No, this was out-of-towners, someone bigger. A larger organization looking to bleed the city from the inside out, starting with its most trusted lieutenants, starting with George. Who's backing them? George asked. Vin coughed again, grimacing from the pain. Could be New York. Could be out of Jersey. Maybe even Baltimore. All I know is, they're smart, organized. They knew I was your cousin, and they still came after me. That means they think you're weak. George stared at the wall, not seeing it, seeing past it. No, he said finally. They think I'm asleep. It was just past midnight when George brought Vin back to Carlo's. They didn't use a hospital. That was a death sentence. Too many eyes, too many ears. Instead, Carlo's basement became the triage room. The old man had seen worse. Shotgun blasts, broken ribs, knife wounds. This wasn't new to him. He'd patched up half the old crew over the years, back when loyalty still meant something. Carlo pulled off Vin's shirt, inspected the bruises, and poured whiskey over the worst of it. Vin flinched but didn't scream. That was enough for George. He'll live, Carlo said after a while, but he won't move right for a few weeks. George nodded, quiet. Then Carlo asked the real question. You believe him? George didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, watching rain bead down the glass. The city outside was sleeping, but not peacefully. The kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion, not comfort. Yeah, he said eventually. I believe him. Carlo sighed. Then we've got a problem. George turned. No, we've got a plan. The next morning, George made a call. Not to someone in the family. To someone outside. Angelo Perry. A name that hadn't been spoken in a long time. Used to run enforcement out in Atlantic City. Quiet guy, ex-boxer, did 5 years in Rahway, came out clean, officially. Unofficially, he moved behind the scenes, did freelance work for people who still remembered how things used to be. George hadn't seen him in over a decade, but some men, when you call, they answer. Angelo's voice was gravel over broken glass. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. I didn't think I'd need to, George replied. But someone's carving up the city while I blinked. I need information, discreet, fast. What's the target? Out-of-town muscle, Jersey, maybe Trenton. Working with Nicky Russo. I want names, movements, and weaknesses. A pause. Then Angelo said, You still pay in silence? George smiled faintly. Always? Click. The call was over, but the wheels were now in motion. 2 nights later, Angelo delivered. Not in person, he was smarter than that, but through a drop. George found the manila envelope taped behind the 3rd trash bin in a church parking lot near Broad Street. Old school. Inside, 3 names, 2 were nobodies. The 3rd one, Dante DeLuca. That name sent a chill through George's spine. DeLuca had been a ghost since the mid-2000s, supposedly buried in a RICO case that vanished in court. A Jersey capo who dodged prison, disappeared, and let people believe he was out of the game. But ghosts don't rest. They just wait. George sat in his car, staring at the name. If DeLuca was backing Nicky, this wasn't just ambition. This was takeover, strategic, measured. A man like DeLuca didn't make wild moves. He played chess, not dice. That meant George was a piece, maybe the last piece, standing between them and a city ripe for the picking. He lit a cigarette and let the smoke fill the cabin. The rain hadn't let up in days. Philly felt like it was drowning in its own history. Concrete cracking, bridges sweating, buildings leaning into each other like tired old men. George whispered to himself, voice nearly lost in the hiss of the rain. If he wants a war, I'll give him one. The next step was Nicky. No more warnings, no more watching. This time, George moved first. He waited until Friday night. The social club on Dickinson Street, Nicky's favorite haunt. Every Friday, like clockwork, he'd show up, press the flesh, buy drinks, laugh too loud. That night was no different. George didn't bring a crew. He brought a name. Vin had told him a phrase Nicky had used, something strange, something rehearsed. When the sun sets on south, the crown comes north. He'd heard it before, years ago, DeLuca's code. So when George walked into the club, quiet and alone, and whispered that phrase into the bartender's ear, the room changed. It was subtle, but George caught it, the way Nicky froze in mid-laugh. The way two men near the jukebox straightened their backs, the way the music suddenly felt a beat too slow. George walked straight up to the bar, ordered a drink, then turned. "Nicky," he said, voice low. The younger man looked pale despite the tan. His grin came too fast. "George, didn't expect you out tonight. You should expect me everywhere." He sipped his drink. "You still talk to DeLuca?" he asked, casual. Nicky blinked. "I don't." "You do, so don't lie." The club was too quiet now, everyone pretending not to listen. George leaned in close. "I know what you're trying, and I know who's backing you. But you made one mistake." Nicky's voice barely held together. "What's that?" George's smile was cold. "You forgot who owns the silence in this city." Then he tossed back the drink, set the glass down, and walked out without another word. He didn't need to say it. He'd just started the clock, and Nicky knew exactly how little time he had left. The city didn't change much at night. It just hid better. Neon signs turned sidewalks into veins of red and blue. Garbage trucks moved like silent ghosts, scooping up the debris of another restless day. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, someone stopped breathing. Life in South Philly moved in cycles: birth, betrayal, burial. And George Borgesi was finally ready to break one of them. He stood on his balcony that night, the city below him soft and blurred through a curtain of rain. In his hand, a cigarette burned slow. He didn't smoke often, only when something old stirred in him, something cold and unspoken. Tonight was one of those nights. Nicky Russo had heard the message. That was the point. You didn't just kill a man like Nicky in a back alley. That was too small, too clean. No, men like him needed to see the blade coming. That was the lesson. It wasn't about the bullet. It was about the silence right before it. Behind George, the apartment was dark except for the glow of the stove light. On the table, a folded piece of paper. Angelo Perry's handwriting, 3 addresses, all in the city. All linked to the Trenton crew, the out-of-towners who thought Philly would open its legs to the first man who whispered sweet power. George took one last drag, crushed the cigarette, and went inside. He poured himself a glass of water. No whiskey tonight. Whiskey made men feel things. George didn't need feelings. He needed facts, and facts don't burn. He stared at the list again. 1. Basement poker den, 25th and Morris. 2. Apartment safe house, 11th and Ellsworth. 3. Repair shop front, Broad and Tasker. George circled the second one. Safe house. That meant someone important stayed there, not just muscle. Maybe the Jersey kid with the red crown tattoo. Maybe someone higher. That would be the first stop. He didn't go in heavy, just a Glock tucked at the small of his back, a blade in his boot, and silence in his heart. He parked 4 blocks away, walked through the alley, and approached the building from the rear. 4 stories, old brick, Windows blacked out with tape. No signs, no cameras. Smart. He slipped inside through a back door that wasn't locked right. Rookie mistake. Inside smelled like sweat and cheap food. He moved slow, boots silent on the linoleum. He climbed the stairs without breathing too loud. 3rd floor. He stopped outside the door, listened. Voices, 2, maybe 3, low, talking about something stupid, a football game from the sound of it. No guards posted, no spotters. These weren't gangsters. These were kids in over their heads, thinking they were bulletproof because someone gave them a taste of power. George knocked. 1 soft knock, then 2 fast. The door cracked open. A kid, early 20s, lean, wearing gold chains too thick for his frame. George moved before the kid could speak. 1 step forward, elbow to the throat, boot to the shin. The kid dropped, gagging, caught between air and panic. George was already inside. The second guy rose from the couch, reaching for something. Too slow. George drew the Glock and pressed it to his temple. "Sit down," he said. The guy sat. Fast. The third didn't move. Just froze near the kitchen, holding a half-eaten sandwich. George kicked the door shut. "Names," he said, voice flat. The kid on the couch stammered. What names?" George stepped forward, pressed the barrel against his knee. "You got 10 seconds to stop being stupid." The kitchen kid spoke first. "Dom, I'm Dom. That's Ray. The other guy's Chris. We're just muscle, man. We don't know anything." George crouched, eye level with the one called Ray. "You got a boss?" Ray nodded. "DeLuca? We don't deal with him direct. We take orders through Nicky or this other guy, Lenny." Lenny who?" "Lenny Valera. He's from Camden. He's the one who set up the apartment." George made a note in his mind. "Is he here?" "No." "Where is he?" "I don't know." George didn't wait. He shot Ray in the foot. The kid screamed. Blood splattered across the carpet. Dom hit the floor, hands up, begging. "He's at the garage on Tasker," Dom yelled. "The old auto repair spot. He stays there at night. I swear." George stood. "Tell him something from me," he said, voice calm as glass. They both stared, wide-eyed, silent. George stepped over Ray's writhing body. "Tell him Philly doesn't kneel." Then he walked out. By sunrise, the neighborhood didn't even know anything had happened. South Philly had that kind of memory. Selective. Nobody called the cops, no sirens. Just the soft sound of tires on wet roads and the rustle of newspapers landing on porches. George didn't sleep. He didn't need to. He met Carlo at a diner on Oregon Avenue, the kind with plastic booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed through a radiator. Perfect. Carlo was already there, nursing a black coffee. "You look like you've been digging graves," Carlo said. George slid into the booth. "I have, and I found one with my name on it." Carlo grunted. "Vin's healing. He wants in." "No," George said. "He's too hot. If they see him, it confirms I'm active. I need them to think I'm reactive, not ahead." Carlo sipped his coffee. "So what's the next step?" George slid the folded paper across the table. "Lenny Valera, Tasker Street, tonight." Carlo unfolded it, scanned the details. "You going in solo again?" "No, this one needs witnesses. I want DeLuca to hear about it before his toast goes cold tomorrow morning." "You want me to bring Sal?" George raised an eyebrow. "Sal's weak. Send him to clean up after." Carlo smirked. "You're getting mean in your old age." George stirred his coffee. "No, just honest." That night they moved. Carlo brought 2 men George trusted, tight-lipped guys from the old days, both of whom had taken bullets without flinching and never said a word in court. The garage on Tasker was mostly abandoned. Metal shutters, busted neon sign, oil stains on the sidewalk from another era. Inside, light glowed from a crack in the back. George led the way. The door opened with a creak. Lenny Valera was inside, sitting at a desk littered with pizza boxes and cigarette butts, flipping through a ledger. He looked up, too slow, just as the first man entered. "What the hell?" George stepped in behind him. Lenny's eyes went wide. "Borgesi! Wait, The butt of George's pistol cracked against his mouth. Blood sprayed across the ledger. Carlo and the others moved to block the exits. George grabbed Lenny by the collar and slammed him into the concrete wall. "You want to play kingmaker in my city?" George growled. "You think this place forgot who owns it?" Lenny spat blood. "You're old, man," he said. "You're running on ghost stories." George pulled the blade from his boot. "I am the ghost," and he drove it through Lenny's thigh. Lenny screamed loud and high like a child. George held him there, pinned against the wall, breathing in his panic. "This is what happens to messengers," he whispered. "Imagine what I'll do to the ones pulling the strings." Then he turned and walked out, blood dripping behind him. That night, back in the apartment, George finally felt it. That quiet peace. Not relief, not victory. Just the stillness that comes after a storm's first strike. He poured a glass of water, opened the window, let the cold air roll in over the bruises of a city that didn't want to be saved. Below, life moved on. Lights blinked on in row rooms. A woman laughed in the distance. Tires splashed through puddles. But above, in that quiet dark where George stood, war had already begun. And the men who thought he was sleeping? They were about to learn what happened when Philly's silence screamed back. For the first time in weeks, the city took a breath. But it was the kind of breath a boxer takes between rounds, bloody, shallow, and bracing for the next punch. Everyone knew something had changed. You could feel it in the sidewalks, in the strange hush around the social clubs, in the way younger guys kept checking over their shoulders, hands twitching too close to their belts. George Borgesi had drawn blood, not just anyone's, Lenny Valera's. The man had limped out of Philly on a stretcher 2 nights ago, carried across the river by 2 silent, terrified Jersey enforcers. His screams still echoed in certain alleyways near Tasker. He was alive, but barely. And more importantly, he was rattled. And when a soldier rattled, the general moved. Dante DeLuca hadn't been seen in public for nearly 6 years. Rumor had him in Florida. Others said he lived in a farmhouse in Sussex County, surrounded by surveillance cameras and ex-cops with itchy trigger fingers. But the truth was something else. Dante had never left. He had simply disappeared behind power, behind layers, the way real bosses do. He let younger men carry his voice, let whispers become commandments. He didn't shoot, didn't shout. He just pointed, and cities bled. But George's message had been sharp enough to pierce even DeLuca's armor. He didn't send a reply through channels. He came in person. It was a cold Thursday evening when DeLuca stepped into the old meat market on Wolf Street, the one that hadn't sold meat since the Bush administration, but still had a walk-in freezer used for other kinds of storage. Nicky Russo was already there, pacing. He looked rough, bags under his eyes, collar damp from sweat, a nervous energy twitching behind his tight jaw. George's visit to the club had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. DeLuca entered quietly. No entourage, no bodyguards. Just a man in a black coat with a silver cane he didn't need, and eyes that made you remember your worst sins. Nicky straightened. "Boss, I didn't know you were coming." DeLuca didn't answer. He walked past the butcher's counter and into the back room, boots clicking softly against concrete. Nicky followed like a dog that had pissed the carpet. Inside, DeLuca sat on a folding chair, pulled out a handkerchief and wiped dust from the armrest. Only then did he speak. "Tell me everything." And so Nicky did. He laid it all out. How the plan was supposed to go, how George was supposed to stay quiet, grow soft, maybe even fade. How they had slowly crept into South Philly, through betting parlors, unions, city contractors. How they'd slipped money into the right pockets and poison into the rest. And then, how it had all started to unravel. George had moved faster than they expected, more precise, smarter. And now, Lenny was in a hospital bed babbling about eyes in the dark and a knife that spoke before it cut. When Nicky finished, DeLuca was silent for a long time. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "You failed." Nicky froze. "Boss," DeLuca stood, slow. His hand rested lightly on the cane. "You had one job, disarm the past, turn legacy into memory. Instead, you've made it myth. You've made him dangerous again." "He's just one man." "No," DeLuca said sharply. "He's not. He's an idea, and you let that idea breathe." Nicky's face went pale. I can fix it. DeLuca stared at him, expression unreadable. I'll give you one chance, he said finally. One. If Borgesi is alive this time next week, I'll replace you, and you'll beg for what I gave Lenny. Then he turned and walked out. That same night, George stood in the back of a small Catholic church on 10th Street. It was late, empty. The priest didn't ask questions. He knew George. Not well, but well enough to know he didn't come for blessings. George sat in the last pew, fingers steepled, staring at the stained glass window like it might blink back. He wasn't religious, not in the way the church wanted, but there was a kind of sacredness in silence, a ritual in reflection. He wasn't thinking about God. He was thinking about lines. Everyone had them, the one line they wouldn't cross. George had spent most of his life pushing right up against that line, toes curling over it. But now it felt like there were no lines left. He had started this war to survive, but something in him was shifting, something older, the part that remembered his uncle's eyes after a clean kill, the part that didn't mourn the blood, just measured it. He didn't want to win, he wanted to end, and the only way to do that was to bury DeLuca. The next morning, Carlo called. I got something, he said. And you're not going to like it. They met at a warehouse near the Navy Yard, one of Carlo's old properties, used for storing things that couldn't be listed on taxes. Inside, on a folding table, was a box. George opened it. Photos, dozens of them. Shots of George in public, at the barber, at the diner, walking into his apartment, some from across the street, some from rooftops, and one taken through his bedroom window. George stared at that one the longest. Carlo didn't speak. He just let the weight of it settle in. They've been watching for months, George said finally. Carlo nodded. That's not all. One of my guys intercepted a burner call last night. Nicky's putting a crew together, 4 shooters, out of town. He's making his move. George smiled, but it wasn't warm. Let him. You're not worried? I'm done being hunted, George said. Time to become the thing in the dark again. That evening, George went to see Vin. His cousin was healing slowly, ribs wrapped, face bruised, but fire back in his eyes. You sure about this? Vin asked. Yeah. You baiting them? George nodded. I leaked word I'd be at an old restaurant on Girard, alone, no muscle. Vin raised an eyebrow. But you won't be alone. No, George said. You'll be on the roof. Carlo's guys in the alley. Angelo's people on standby. But I want them to think I'm walking into the light. Vin leaned forward. What if they come heavy? Then we make the ground remember their names. The night came like a curtain. George arrived at the restaurant, an old Italian place boarded up for years, with just enough power left for a few flickering lights. He sat in the center of the room, no gun drawn, just a glass of water, like a man waiting for company. Outside, the city slept, but inside, 4 men approached from different directions. Black jackets, gloves, hard eyes. They didn't knock. They came in through the kitchen, the alley, even the roof access. George didn't move. He watched them surround the table. Then he said, "You boys look lost." One of them raised his pistol, but before he could fire, boom, the lights cut, glass shattered, a flashbang dropped from the ceiling vent. Chaos exploded. Carlo's men moved from the shadows, surgical and silent. 2 shooters dropped before they fired. One ran, made it 3 steps, and Vin tackled him from behind like a linebacker possessed. The last man, the one who'd spoken, was left breathing, trembling, hands up. George walked over, kneeled. "Who sent you?" he asked. The man swallowed. "Nicky. Said you were alone. Said to put one in your mouth and one in your chest." George nodded. Then he stood, turned, and walked to the door. "Clean it," he told Carlo. He didn't look back. Philadelphia was always a city of noise. Even in silence, there was a hum underneath, a heartbeat made of train tracks, whispers in corner stores, the soft echo of footsteps in alleys too narrow for sunlight. But over the past few days, something had shifted. The usual rhythm was fractured. People didn't linger on stoops. Conversations died too fast. The bars were quieter. Even the cops looked over their shoulders a little more, because they all knew, George Borgesi was awake, and someone was about to be punished for thinking he was ever asleep. Carlo watched George from across the table in the old Italian social hall off Rittner Street. The building smelled like oil and old wood. It hadn't seen a real party in a decade, but tonight it was hosting something heavier than music, strategy. "I'm hearing whispers from North Jersey," Carlo said. "DeLuca's people are getting spooked. He took out 4 of his hitters in one move. That doesn't go unnoticed." George sipped his coffee. Black, no sugar. "They were sloppy. Should have known I don't walk into rooms without knowing who built them." Carlo nodded. "Still, you sure about going loud?" George leaned forward. "You don't send a message by whispering it. You carve it into the skin of the city so it never forgets." Carlo grunted. "So what's the play?" George set the cup down, pulled a small folded piece of paper from his pocket, handed it over. Carlo read it. His eyes narrowed. "This ain't subtle. Subtle's over." 3 nights later, a luxury vehicle was parked outside a private club in Atlantic City. Black BMW, custom wheels, license plate registered to a shell company out of Newark. It belonged to Vince Giordano, a mid-level Jersey earner with ties to DeLuca. He wasn't important enough to be guarded, but important enough to be noticed. That night, as he walked to his car, checking his phone and lighting a cigar, a figure approached from the shadows, one gunshot to the kneecap, another to the shoulder. Giordano went down screaming, dropped the cigar, the flames sparking on the wet pavement. The figure leaned down, real close, no mask, just George, calm, cold. "You tell DeLuca this isn't business anymore," he said softly. "This is personal. You stepped into my city. You tried to kill me. You thought I'd go quietly." Giordano was shaking, bleeding onto the asphalt. George stood. "You forgot who raised this ground you're walking on." Then he walked away. No rush, no sirens. By the time the first call went to 911, George was halfway back to Philadelphia, the night behind him folded up like a closing wound. The message traveled fast. Giordano survived, barely, but he talked. Not to the cops, but to DeLuca's people. Word hit every ear it needed to, and it burned, because it wasn't just about one man getting shot. It was the tone. George didn't hide, didn't bluff. He looked one of DeLuca's own in the eye and made it clear. This war was no longer polite. DeLuca, for the first time in years, called a sit-down. It was held in a warehouse in Camden, neutral ground. 3 men represented DeLuca's side, a consigliere, a shooter, and a fixer. George brought only Carlo. No Vin. Not yet. Vin still had healing to do, and there were things George needed to say without younger ears in the room. The warehouse smelled of cold metal and damp rot. A folding table sat under a single hanging bulb. 6 chairs, no frills. The Jersey men sat first. George entered like it was his own funeral. The fixer, a thin man with manicured fingers, opened the meeting. "Mr. DeLuca believes this war is unnecessary. There's room for collaboration." George sat, took his time lighting a cigarette. "You put a hit on me. That's not collaboration. That's suicide with extra steps." The consigliere spoke next. "No one authorized lethal action. Those men were freelance, undisciplined. There's no record of—" "Cut the theater," George interrupted. He leaned forward, the smoke curling from his lips like a sermon. "I've let it go on too long. All the creeping in, all the whispers. I gave you your space. I stayed in mine. But then you sent little boys with big guns into my home." He looked at each man in turn. "You don't get to do that and then ask for peace." The shooter, young, twitchy, already sweating, opened his mouth to speak. George cut him off with a glare sharp enough to slice glass. "Tell DeLuca this. I'm not negotiating with ghosts. If he wants a meeting, he shows his face. If he wants Philly, he better come with a goddamn army. And if he wants war," George flicked ash onto the table, "he's already lost." He stood. Carlo followed. Nobody moved to stop him. And that was how you knew the fear had finally landed. 2 days later, George sat with Vin in a quiet booth at a steakhouse on Washington Avenue. The place was dark, wood-paneled, the kind of old-school joint that smelled like whiskey and garlic. Vin looked better, still sore, but sharper. The bruises on his face were fading, and the light in his eyes was back. He leaned in, tone low. "I heard what you did to Giordano." George just nodded. "Guy's a mess now. Can't walk, can't sleep. Told his crew he saw death staring back at him through your face." George stabbed a piece of steak, chewed it slow. "You scared?" Vin asked, smiling slightly. "No, because I am." George finally looked up. "You should be. That's how we stay alive." Vin sat back, exhaled. "What's the next move?" George wiped his mouth, took a sip of water. "We make it public." Vin raised a brow. "How public?" George looked out the window, where rain was once again tapping on the glass like an old friend come to check in. "I want the city to hear it. Not just the crews, not just the rats and the runners. Everyone. The bartenders, the bakers, the city councilmen who pretend they don't know where their envelopes come from." Vin waited. And then George said it. "We're taking back the streets." It started that weekend, not with blood, with presence. George's men returned to old haunts. Poker games reopened under his watch. Protection crews moved door to door, not shaking down, but reassuring. Old allies were called in. Some were flown in. Carlo dusted off his Rolodex. Vin hit the streets with a limp and a purpose. In 3 days, George's face was seen more than it had been in the last year. And in a city like Philadelphia, being seen is power. He visited a bakery in South Philly, bought a loaf of bread, talked to the owner like they were family, because they were, in their own way. He showed up at a christening, slipped a wad of hundreds into the godfather's coat pocket, kissed a baby's forehead. He even walked into a local precinct, said nothing, just smiled at the captain, and walked out again. It wasn't arrogance, it was a reclaiming, letting the city remember. George Borgesi isn't dead. He's still the silence you fear when the phone stops ringing. Meanwhile, DeLuca began to feel the walls closing. Giordano was useless now. Nicky was scrambling, failing to reassert control. 3 of his street-level collectors disappeared. No bodies, just gone. Then, one of his safe houses in North Camden burned. Fire department said electrical. Everyone else knew better. DeLuca's voice, once calm, now cracked during phone calls. He asked for options. One of his lieutenants finally said the truth out loud. "Boss, maybe we shouldn't have come to Philly." Back in his apartment, George sat at the window, the soft city hum rising below him like a hymn. His phone buzzed once, a message from Carlo. "We got one of DeLuca's top guys, picked him up near the docks." George stood slowly, slipped on his coat. Before he walked out, he looked around the apartment. Nothing had changed, but everything had. The war was no longer coming. It was here. And the next body to drop would carry a message written in blood. The warehouse was colder than usual. It sat just off Pattison Avenue, quiet between the shipping yards and the wide curve of the Delaware River. A place where no one came unless they had a reason, and today, George had one. A big one. Carlo met him at the loading dock. His coat was heavy, shoulders hunched against the chill. "He's inside," Carlo said. "Cuffed, alone. Didn't say much on the way in." George nodded once. "What's his name?" "Anthony Cilieri," Carlo replied. "Goes by Sills. DeLuca's former driver turned errand man. But word is he's doing more than carrying lunch. He's been handling intel, surveillance, drops, possibly hits." George looked past him, toward the door. "And he let himself get caught?" Carlo shrugged. "He didn't exactly come quietly. Vin cracked 2 of his ribs." That earned the faintest smirk from George. "You sure he knows who's holding him?" Carlo glanced over. "He knows." George stepped forward. "Let me in alone." Carlo didn't argue. Just opened the door and walked away, his boots crunching on gravel. Inside, the air smelled like rust and motor oil. The single bulb above the metal chair flickered every few seconds, the shadows twitching along the walls like rats. In the center sat Anthony Cilieri, head down, hands cuffed behind the chair, a cut above one eye that was still seeping red. He looked up as George entered, slow and silent. For a few long seconds, they just stared at each other. Then, Cilieri spoke. "Was wondering when you'd show up, Mr. Borgesi." George didn't respond. He walked in a slow circle around the chair, watching the man breathe. You know who I am, Chiliari continued, which means you know why I'm here. George finally stopped in front of him. I know you're loyal to a man who sends kids to die in a city he doesn't understand. Chiliari smiled through the pain. You still talk like a priest, Georgie, like words still matter. George's eyes narrowed. Last man who called me Georgie bled out in the snow. Chiliari nodded slowly, as if cataloging that detail. I'm not here to scare you, George said. I'm here because someone like you, who's worked that close to DeLuca, doesn't get caught unless he wants to. Silence. Then Chiliari said something unexpected. You remember Blackie Marchese? George froze. The name hit like a brick to the chest. Blackie. Blackie had been George's mentor, a mid-tier enforcer who taught him how to drive the getaway car before George was old enough to legally buy cigarettes. Killed in '94, ambushed after leaving a poker game. George had never fully accepted the official story. Too clean, too sudden. What does Blackie have to do with you? George asked, his voice lower now. Chiliari smiled, teeth stained with blood. He was my uncle. George stared at him. I didn't know. Yeah, you wouldn't. Blackie kept secrets better than most, even from you. George didn't like the direction this was going. You're saying this is personal? No, Chiliari said. I'm saying this is legacy. You're out here playing chess with DeLuca, but there's a deeper game happening, and Blackie was one of the first pawns. George stepped closer. The room felt tighter now, like the walls had started breathing. You gonna tell me who moved the piece? Chiliari laughed softly. You ever think about how quick Blackie went out? How fast his name disappeared from the streets? No one wore his name. No one lit candles. Not even you. George's jaw tightened. I was young. I didn't have the pull. You had pull with people who did, Chiliari snapped, but you didn't use it. George took a breath. The past had a way of reaching into the lungs and stealing your air. So what are you saying? He asked. Chiliari's voice lowered. I'm saying DeLuca was there that night. The hit on my uncle? It wasn't random. It was ordered, and not just for money. It was to silence him. George went quiet. Chiliari continued. My uncle found out DeLuca was setting up a side game, moving Philly money into Jersey without clearing it. Blackie was loyal to the city, loyal to your family, and when he threatened to blow the whistle, DeLuca had him erased. The warehouse grew colder. George's hands curled into fists at his sides. Why now? He asked. Chiliari tilted his head, the blood from his eyebrow dripping slowly down his cheek. Because I got tired of being the driver, of holding the gun and never pulling it. I've been watching DeLuca rot from the inside out. He's afraid of you now. That's why I let your guys take me. I wanted to talk. George stepped back, studying the man. His eyes were clouded with pain, but there was something else. Truth. Then talk, George said. Chiliari nodded. There's a meeting. Tomorrow, South Jersey. A farmhouse DeLuca uses when he wants no eyes on him. He's bringing his top 3 capos. He wants to move fast. Take out your whole structure in 1 week. Vin, Carlo, you, anyone loyal to the old rules. George exhaled through his nose. What's the play? They're planning a double hit. 1 crew in Philly, 1 in Jersey. They've already picked targets. They're assuming you're still playing defense. George stepped closer. I'm not. Chiliari smiled faintly. I know. That's why I'm telling you now. You hit that meeting before it happens. You end the war. Cut off the head. George paced once. You're sure DeLuca will be there? Yes. And no muscle. He doesn't bring guards to that place, just captains, trusted men. George looked down at the man in the chair. What do you want in return? Chiliari leaned back as far as the cuffs would allow. Safe exit. I disappear. I'm done with this life. George nodded once. Then he pulled a key from his pocket, walked behind the chair, unlocked the cuffs. Chiliari stood slowly, stretching his arms, wincing as the pain hit. I didn't expect you to let me go so easy, he said. George looked at him hard. You gave me something DeLuca couldn't. What's that? A reason. That night, George met with Carlo and Vin in the apartment above the tailor shop. The rain was hitting the window hard again. like the sky couldn't decide if it was morning or angry. George laid out the plan in measured steps. I want 2 cars. One approaches from the west, one from the north. No lights. We hit just before dawn. No backup. Just us. Carlo nodded, already making notes in his head. Vin looked uneasy. You trust this guy? He asked. George didn't hesitate. I trust the wound. They were quiet for a long time after that. Then Vin said, You really think this ends with DeLuca? George stared out the window, the city blurred behind raindrops. It has to. The next morning was gray, heavy with fog. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a field off Route 47, hidden behind a line of dying pine trees. No fences, no motion sensors, just a gravel drive and an old red barn out back. George's car rolled to a stop 300 yards out. He stepped out into the mist, coat buttoned, gun tucked under his arm, blade at his ankle. Carlo and Vin followed without a word. They moved slow, deliberate, cutting across the wet grass like shadows. When they reached the edge of the property, George raised a hand, stopped. Voices inside, laughter. They were in there, relaxed, unaware. George looked at Vin, then Carlo. Once we open that door, he said, everything changes. Vin nodded. Everything already did. George stepped forward and knocked. 3 short raps. The door opened. The first man didn't even get to scream before the barrel of George's pistol met his teeth. The first man never had a chance. He opened the door like it was a routine knock, expecting a capo late for coffee, maybe one of the Jersey guys with bad jokes and worse cologne. Instead, he got a cold barrel pressed into his mouth and a finger twitching against a trigger. George didn't wait. The shot rang out sharp, cracking through bone and memory. The man dropped like a puppet cut loose, his body folding at George's feet, the farmhouse already soaked in silence and gunpowder. Inside, the laughter stopped. Then, shouts, movement, chairs scraping, boots thudding on old wood floors. George didn't flinch. He stepped over the body and moved through the doorway, Vin behind him, Carlo taking up the rear with deadly calm. No one shouted commands, no one screamed threats. They were past that. This was an execution, not of people, of plans, of betrayal, of a future stolen from their hands. The hallway opened into the main room, big, rustic, all wood beams and exposed brick. A table sat at the center, 6 plates, steam still curling off untouched eggs and sausage. The air smelled like syrup and sweat. A fake, warm life. George hated it. A man rose from the head of the table, bald, square-faced, in a gray wool coat too clean for a place this dirty. DeLuca. They locked eyes. George didn't speak. He raised the gun and shot the man to DeLuca's left, a fat capo named Markelli who once ran the Camden docks. The bullet hit him in the chest. He stumbled backward, crashing into a window that didn't break. Screams now. Chaos. DeLuca ducked, reaching for something beneath the table. Too slow. George fired again, hitting another man in the thigh. Vin moved in like a shadow, grabbing the shooter near the stove and slamming his face into the counter. Only Carlo didn't fire. He moved methodically, checking doors, watching angles, ready to end anyone who flinched wrong. When the smoke settled, 2 men were dead. One was on the floor, bleeding from the leg. And DeLuca, still standing, arms up, breathing heavy, eyes wild but calculating. George stared at him, took 3 slow steps forward. DeLuca finally spoke. You really think this changes anything? George didn't answer. You shoot me and the rest won't stop. They'll come from New York, from Jersey, from Baltimore. George cut him off with a wordless gesture. Not yet. He walked up to the table, stared down at the half-finished breakfast, then tipped a carafe of coffee with the back of his hand. It spilled like blood, dark and steaming, soaking into the white tablecloth. You remember Blackie Marchese? George asked softly. DeLuca froze. You killed him, George said. You silenced him because he stood in your way, because he was loyal to this city, and you wanted to carve it up like a steak. DeLuca shook his head. You don't know what you're talking about. I do, George said. Your man Cilieri told me everything. DeLuca's face twitched, just once. Anthony was a driver, a nobody. He remembered enough to know you had Blackie clipped, and now I know it too. DeLuca's hands dropped just slightly. You think this makes you a hero, George? You're just another name on a long list. You think killing me will end the greed, the politics, the rot? George stepped closer, voice quieter now. No, but it'll end you, and that's enough. He raised the pistol. DeLuca laughed, bitter and sudden. You're still that kid, you know, trying to make sense of a world that doesn't care. You think you're justice. You're just history dressed in black. George pulled the trigger. The bullet hit DeLuca in the chest. He stumbled back, mouth open in shock, and dropped into the chair he'd been sitting in moments earlier. Blood bloomed across his shirt like a cursed flower. His eyes stared up, not angry, just confused. Then they went still. George lowered the gun. The room held its breath. Vin leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Carlo stepped over a body and grabbed the man on the floor, the one with the leg wound, pulled him upright. Name, Carlo barked. Frank Loria, the man gasped. Please, I don't want... Carlo looked at George. George studied him. Tell your people what you saw, he said. Tell them DeLuca begged. Tell them Philly's not for sale. Loria nodded fast. Carlo dropped him like trash. They didn't stay to clean. They walked out, leaving the room colder than when they came. The drive back was silent. Rain tapped the windshield like a steady drumbeat, the kind of sound that feels like it's echoing inside your chest. George sat in the front seat, watching the road like it might twist into something he didn't expect. Vin drove. His hands shook a little, but not from fear, from something deeper, that aftershock you feel when death's weight has passed you by. Carlo sat in the back, arms crossed, face unreadable. Finally, Vin said, "That was the right call." George didn't answer, because he wasn't sure if it was. He'd ended DeLuca, but something still felt unfinished. Not in the streets, not in the power plays. Those were clean now, shifting back toward him like water finding its natural course. No, what was unfinished was inside. A voice he hadn't heard in years was starting to whisper again. Not Blackie, his own. The younger version of himself, the boy who used to believe there was an honor code, a line even mobsters wouldn't cross, that there was a reason for the violence, protection, family, control. Now it felt like all of that had blurred. Like maybe he wasn't protecting Philly anymore. Maybe he was just too damn used to the silence that came after the shot. Back in South Philly, word spread fast. DeLuca was dead. Some said he died of a heart attack. Some said he got hit in a Jersey beef gone wrong. Some, the smart ones, said George Borgesi walked into a lion's den and came out with the lion's head. The city breathed easier. No more whispers, no more slow war. Crews that had drifted toward Jersey came crawling back. Union guys who'd hesitated on envelopes now paid on time. The bars started buzzing again. The corners got loud again. It was like Philly had remembered its old rhythm. But George didn't sleep. He sat by the window every night like he had for years, looking out, watching, waiting. Because something inside him said it wasn't over, and he'd learned to trust that voice. The city was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was something else. A pause between storms. The kind of silence that made you tighten your coat and check your mirrors, even when the streets looked clear, even when the enemies were gone. George Borgesi knew that silence. He'd grown up in it, and this one felt wrong. 3 days after the farmhouse hit, the rain finally stopped. The sky over South Philly cracked open like it was exhausted from holding too much. The streets steamed, old bricks sweated, and people came out again, not laughing yet, but walking like maybe they could. George stood on the sidewalk outside the old bakery near Moore Street, the same one where his mother used to buy Sunday bread. The bell over the door hadn't changed. Neither had the smell. Fresh rolls, ground espresso, a hint of burnt sugar from pastries that never sold. Vin was with him, healing well, still limping, but stronger now. His eyes were sharper than they'd been in weeks. "You sure you want to be out here?" Vin asked. "Word's out. Everyone knows what you did. The streets are watching again." George nodded slowly. "That's the point." They stepped inside. Behind the counter was Angie, late 50s, hair pulled tight, sleeves rolled. She didn't flinch when she saw George, just nodded and reached for the bag with his name on it. "You're late," she said. George smiled faintly. "DeLuca slowed traffic," she smirked. "Heard he choked on his own power." George said nothing. That was the thing about old neighborhoods. They didn't need proof. They didn't need news stories. They just knew. Angie handed him the bag. "Your uncle would have been proud," she said, a little softer. George nodded, the words sitting too heavy to respond to. He left without eating anything. Outside, Vin stopped walking. "You hear that?" George paused. In the alley behind the bakery, a faint sound, like someone moving too slowly, trying too hard to be quiet. Vin drew his pistol. George didn't. He walked straight into the alley, steps calm, measured, like he'd already played the scene in his head. And he had. There, behind the dumpster, slumped and bleeding, was a man he recognized. Frank Loria. The same one George had let walk away from the farmhouse, the man who was supposed to run back to Jersey with a warning in his mouth and fear in his eyes. But he hadn't run far. He'd come back. And now he was dying. George knelt beside him, expression unreadable. "What happened?" Loria coughed, blood on his lips. His shirt was soaked. 3 wounds, chest, shoulder, stomach. "Didn't go back," he whispered. "Didn't tell them anything." "Then who did this to you?" George asked, voice low, cold. Loria blinked slow. His hand shook as it tried to reach into his coat. Vin moved forward, tense, but George held up a hand. "Let him." Loria pulled out a folded piece of paper. Blood stained the edges. George took it, opened it. Inside was a name, a single name, Vincent. George didn't react, just stared at the paper. Vin stepped closer. "What is it?" George didn't answer. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Loria slumped further, eyes fluttering. "They didn't trust me," he mumbled. "Thought I'd flipped, but I didn't. I was just tired. Tired of all of it." George looked him in the eye. "You get your piece now." And Loria, bleeding into the concrete, nodded once before the last breath slipped out of him. Back at the apartment, George said nothing. He sat in his usual chair near the window, the city glowing dim outside. Vin sat across from him, watching, waiting. "Who was he?" Vin finally asked. "Scared," George replied. "Too scared to lie." Vin frowned. "What did the note say?" George didn't look up. "It said your name." Vin blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" "You tell me." Now Vin was on his feet. "You think I had something to do with this? With Loria? With DeLuca?" George didn't move. His voice didn't rise. "I think someone inside my circle fed them information. I think they knew where I'd be too often, knew too much. And I think it's time I stop assuming people are what they used to be." Vin's face tightened. "You serious right now?" George finally looked at him, really looked. "I trusted you, more than anyone, more than I should have." Vin stepped back, hands raised. "I took a beating for you, nearly died for you. And maybe you thought that would cover your tracks," George said, standing now, slow, deliberate. "Maybe you thought if you bled enough, I'd never question you." Vin's eyes darted. He didn't go for his gun. But he did flinch, and George saw it. "What aren't you telling me?" George asked. Vin exhaled hard, then said nothing, and that was louder than anything. Later that night, George drove alone. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not Carlo, not the crew. He just got in the car and let the streets take him. South, past the river, past the warehouses, toward the place where silence lived. He stopped near the waterfront. The wind coming off the river was sharp, the kind that stung your face and cleared your thoughts. He stepped out of the car, walked to the edge of the dock, and pulled out the paper again. Vincent. Just that. No last name. But it didn't need one. George had known the truth before the note. He'd known it since the night DeLuca's first hit squad found him too easily. He just didn't want to believe it. But now, with blood drying in the alley and the wind howling around him, belief didn't matter. Only action did. Back at the apartment, George poured a drink. Not water. This time, whiskey. The burn steadied his hand. Carlo showed up an hour later. No words, just eyes that saw too much. George handed him the note. Carlo read it, then looked up. "You believe it?" "I have to." Carlo nodded once, sat down. "You want me to handle it?" George shook his head. "No, this one's mine." They sat in silence, two old wolves watching the moon, both knowing what came next. Vin didn't run. George didn't expect him to. He showed up at the tailor shop the next day, like nothing was wrong, like the air wasn't thick with coming fire. George met him at the back, where the steam from the pressing machines hid most things. Vin lit a cigarette. "You want to talk about it?" George nodded. "I want the truth." Vin exhaled smoke. "I didn't flip, not the way you think." "Then how?" Vin looked away. "It started with money. DeLuca's guys offered a piece of an off-the-books betting ring. I thought it was small, harmless, just something on the side." George didn't speak. Vin continued. "Then it got bigger. Names, schedules, locations. They pressured me. Said if I didn't keep feeding them, they'd burn me. Or worse, burn you." George stepped forward. "You let them try to kill me." "No," Vin shouted. "I didn't know about the first hit, I swear. But after that, I couldn't get out. They had everything. Tapes, messages. They said if I told you, they'd go public. Take down the whole operation. I was protecting you." George's voice was ice. "You were protecting yourself." Vin dropped the cigarette. "I made a mistake." "No," George said, pulling the gun. "You made a choice." Vin froze, tears in his eyes now. "We're blood, George." "Blood spills," George said, and fired. One shot straight to the chest. Vin dropped, eyes wide, breath gone. George stood over him, silent. Back at the apartment, George sat down. He poured another glass, looked out the window. The city didn't know what had just happened. It kept moving. It always did. But inside George, something stopped. He hadn't just killed a traitor. He'd killed the last person who remembered what he used to be. And now there was no one left to call him Georgie. The chair by the window hadn't moved. Same place, same angle, same quiet view. But George hadn't sat in it in 3 days. Not since he shot Vin. Not since the silence in his apartment stopped being comfortable and started feeling like a weight pressing against his ribs. It was strange. He'd killed more men than he could count. Some clean, some messy. Some who had it coming, a few who didn't. But this felt different. Because Vin had known him before the name George Borgesi meant something. Before titles, before power. When he was just a wiry South Philly kid with fists too fast and questions too dangerous. Now that kid was gone. And the man who remained was king of a city that didn't sleep and didn't grieve. Carlo handled the cleanup. He always did. Vin was buried in a plot just outside the city, near a stone church that still rang bells on Sundays. The headstone was blank for now. Carlo said it would stay that way, until the world forgets him. George didn't attend the burial, not out of shame, but because there was nothing left to bury. The moment Vin looked him in the eye and said, "I was protecting you," George had stopped seeing family. All he saw was a man who made a choice, and choices had consequences. Still, the dreams came. Not vivid, not loud, just fragments. Vin's voice, laughter from decades ago. That summer they hustled dice behind the church steps. The time they snuck into a union hall and stole cigars like they were robbing a bank. Vin's stupid laugh echoing as they ran down Passyunk, shirts soaked in sweat and pride. And now, silence. Dreams that ended the same way. George standing alone, surrounded by faces with no eyes, and the only sound was his own breathing. Power came fast after the blood. DeLuca's crews folded within days. Most didn't even wait for George's phone call. They came on their own, heads down, hats in hand, ready to pledge allegiance to a flag they once tried to burn. George didn't forgive them, but he used them. That was the difference now. Before, George had built loyalty, earned it, spoke with his hands when he needed to, but more often with his presence. A nod, a glance, a silence that said, "You're safe under me." Now the looks he gave said something else. "You're only alive because I haven't decided otherwise." One by one, the old rackets returned, the betting operations, The card rooms behind bars, the trucking union contracts that had gone cold. Even the cops, the ones who remembered his uncle's era, began looking the other way again. Not because of envelopes, not because of fear, but because George had become the constant. No more turf wars, no more whispers about Jersey. Philadelphia was his again. But he'd never felt further from it. On the surface, everything was right. Money flowed, respect returned. Even Angie at the bakery smiled more when George came by, handed him bread without saying anything, just a soft squeeze on the hand, like she knew something heavy had passed between them all. But at night, George sat at the kitchen table and listened to the refrigerator hum, listened for footsteps that never came, voices that never spoke. Even the city's noise, the sirens, the late-night shouting, the crack of bottles in alleys, seemed quieter, like the world had stopped arguing with him. And now, all that was left was the echo. Carlo noticed. Of course he did. They were sitting in the back of an old bar off 13th Street, one that had been closed for repairs for 3 years, the kind of place you didn't find unless someone invited you. 2 drinks between them, no music, just the hum of old beer signs and the sound of weather beating against the window. "You're thinking too much," Carlo said. George didn't answer. "Vin made his choice, you made yours." Still, George said nothing. Carlo leaned in, softer now. "I've buried friends too, brothers, guys I'd bleed for. This life don't let you keep anyone too close." George looked down at his glass. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Carlo gave a dry chuckle. "That's the thing, Georgie. None of us start out wanting to sit alone in the dark." George looked up, eyes sharper now. "But here we are." 2 nights later, a kid tried to rob one of George's runners. Young, maybe 18. Skinny arms, nervous twitch. Probably hadn't eaten in 2 days. He jumped the guy near 8th and Morris, took the envelope, ran 3 blocks before Carlo's boys caught him. They brought him to the tailor shop, threw him in the back room. Bloody nose, eyes wide, hands shaking like a leaf. George sat across from him, didn't raise his voice, didn't touch the gun on the table, just watched. The kid muttered, "I didn't know it was yours." George raised an eyebrow. "So you thought it was someone else's money?" The kid swallowed. "I was hungry, man. I didn't mean anything by it, just stupid. I'll pay it back." George leaned forward, slow. "You think this city forgives the hungry?" The kid shook his head, blinking fast, like he was trying not to cry. George stared for a long time. Then he nodded to Carlo. "Let him go." Carlo blinked. "You sure?" George stood. "If he tries again, break his hands. But not today." They let the kid stumble out into the dark. Carlo watched him go. "You're getting soft." George lit a cigarette. "No," he said. "I'm just tired of ghosts." The next morning, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a burner call, an envelope, no return address. Inside, a photograph, black and white, faded. George and Vin, maybe 17, standing in front of a rusted-out Cadillac, both grinning like they'd stolen the whole world and no one had noticed yet. No note, just the photo. George stared at it for a long time, hands still, heart quieter than usual. Then, slowly, he flipped it over. On the back, in faded ink. Some things don't come back. He folded it carefully, slipped it into the drawer next to the notebook, then went back to the window. Outside, the city moved on. A bus groaned past the corner. A man shouted at his dog. A woman on her porch poured coffee into a plastic cup, nodding to the mailman as he passed. Everything was normal. Everything had returned. But George knew the truth. Peace was a costume, and he was wearing it with a gun under the jacket. It came on a Monday. No knock on the door, no sudden phone call. Just a quiet envelope slipped under the tailor shop door at dawn, before even the street sweepers had started their rounds. George found it while locking up after a late breakfast. Cream paper, expensive, no return address, the kind of envelope that came from old money. Not flashy, not loud, but worn with arrogance. The way a man might hand you a bullet and expect you to thank him for the metal. Inside was a single note, typed clean on thick stock. "Your city isn't just watched from the streets, Mr. Borgesi. Some of us watch it from above. Let's talk. Tuesday, 9 p.m., the Federal Club. Ask for room 4. No name, no threat, just an invitation. George read it twice, then once more, slower. He didn't like it. The Federal Club wasn't on any map, not officially. Tucked in the top 2 floors of an old bank building near Rittenhouse Square, it had no sign out front, no website, no reviews. You didn't get in unless someone powerful told you that you could. It wasn't where mobsters played. It was where the people who used mobsters played. Lobbyists, judges, developers, men who could ruin cities without touching a gun. George had never been inside. Until now. Tuesday night came fast. George wore black. No tie, no ring, no coat, just his presence. That was enough. Carlo offered to come. George refused. If they're calling me to the roof, I don't need a ladder behind me, George said. He arrived alone. The doorman said nothing, just opened the brass-framed door and stepped aside. Inside was all marble and silence. No security, no cameras in sight. But George could feel the surveillance, the invisible kind. The kind built into the walls, the ceilings, the very air. He made his way to the elevator, pressed 6. It opened to a quiet corridor lined with red carpet and gold sconces, room numbers carved into wood. Room 4. He knocked once. The door opened on its own. Inside, the room was dim but elegant. Bookshelves, leather chairs, a roaring fireplace, and in front of it, sitting with a tumbler of scotch in hand, was a man George had only seen once before. Councilman Patrick Wexler. Late 50s, perfect hair, soft hands, face like a lawyer who never had to raise his voice because he owned the judge. Wexler stood, extended a hand. George didn't take it. Wexler smiled, sat back down. "I've been following your work." George stayed standing. "I didn't know I was auditioning." Wexler chuckled softly. "Oh, you weren't. The power is like art. You don't always know when it's being painted. Sometimes you just walk into the room and realize you're staring at a masterpiece." George said nothing. Wexler gestured to the other chair. "Please, let's not waste energy pretending I'm not going to ask you to sit." George finally moved, sat, legs planted, arms resting on the sides. A lion at rest, not relaxed. Wexler sipped his drink. "I admire what you've done. Philadelphia was a mess, street crews scattered, weak leadership, out-of-town money trying to carve up something they didn't understand." He leaned forward. "You brought it all back under one roof. That's rare. That's valuable." George stared at him. "You didn't call me here to compliment my resume." Wexler nodded, smiling. "Of course not." He set his glass down, folded his hands. "I called you here because you're powerful, Mr. Borgesi, but not invincible. You rule with fear, respect, history. But I deal in something bigger." George raised an eyebrow. "Legislation." Wexler chuckled again. "Leverage." He stood, walked to a cabinet, pulled out a folder, dropped it on the coffee table between them. George didn't touch it. Wexler opened it himself. Inside were photos. Black and white surveillance stills, some old, some new. George and Vin. George at the tailor shop, George at the bakery, George shaking hands with a man whose face was blurred. A ledger, names, transactions, enough to build a case or a narrative. Wexler looked him in the eye. "I don't want to hurt you." George didn't blink. "That folder says different." "No," Wexler said calmly. "That folder says I could, but I won't." He walked back to the chair, sat. "Because I want to hire you." Silence. George's fingers curled slightly on the armrest. Wexler continued. "This city's about to shift. Big developments coming. Land deals, infrastructure projects, union contracts. We're going to need silence, movement, pressure in the right places." He leaned in. "And I can't have that without someone like you." George studied him for a long moment. Then said, "What's the price?" Wexler smiled like a man who'd just won the long game. "Discretion, loyalty, and the ability to walk away from certain personal matters." George exhaled through his nose. "Or what?" Wexler didn't raise his voice, didn't blink. "I burn everything. I don't go through the courts. I go through the newspapers, the unions, your own people. I whisper the right lies in the right ears until even your most loyal start wondering who you are. He sipped his scotch. I don't want to do that, George. I want you at the table. George stood slowly, looked down at the man, and for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since the war began. Cornered, not by muscle, not by bullets, by a man who smiled while twisting the knife. Wexler offered a card. George didn't take it. Just said, "You're not the first man to try and use me." Wexler smiled again. "But I'll be the last." George left without another word. The elevator ride down felt too slow. When he stepped out onto the street, the cold hit harder. The wind off the buildings felt like it carried poison. He lit a cigarette and didn't taste it. Just walked. Down Broad Street, past places he'd once ruled by presence alone. Tonight, it didn't feel like enough. Wexler had changed the game. He wasn't trying to take Philly from George. He was trying to buy him, with threats dressed as opportunities. Back at the apartment, George poured a drink. Didn't sit, didn't eat. He stood by the window and stared out at the city he'd bled for. This was the new war. No guns, no crews, just suits and files and whispers passed in rooms too clean to hold blood. And he didn't know yet if he was ready for it. But one thing was clear. Wexler had made a move. And now, George would make one of his own. The city moved like a machine now, smoother, quieter, like something had been fixed beneath the surface. But George Borgesi didn't trust quiet machines. They usually meant someone else was at the controls. For days after the meeting at the Federal Club, George didn't react, didn't speak of Wexler, didn't make calls. On the surface, it looked like he'd swallowed the threat, like he was thinking it over. And that was exactly what he wanted Wexler to believe. In reality, George had already begun pulling threads. He didn't go after Wexler directly. That would be suicide. A man like that didn't flinch at bullets. He flinched at exposure, embarrassment, loss of reputation. So George did what he did best. He started listening. And he sent Angelo Perry. Angelo had a face that never aged, one of those wiry Italian mugs that made you think he'd been 35 since the Cold War. He moved like a ghost and asked questions like he was just curious. A waiter, a bartender, a guy standing too close to the valet. In 4 days, he built a list. Wexler had vulnerabilities. Not many, but enough. On a cold Thursday night, George sat with Carlo in the back of the old meat market. He passed him the folder Angelo had assembled. Carlo flipped through it, slow. He whistled once. "Jesus," George nodded. "You believe it?" Enough to burn him twice. Inside were names, deals made behind zoning boards, contracts awarded to companies that didn't exist 3 years ago. Photos of Wexler with a woman who wasn't his wife, entering a brownstone in Fairmount that the city technically owned, and bank transfers, quiet ones, from developers with Jersey ties, some from as far south as D.C. George poured them both coffee. "This isn't about money," he said. "Wexler's not a greedy man. He's a careful one. That's worse." Carlo leaned back. "So what's the plan?" George's eyes narrowed. "We break the part of him he values most." Carlo nodded. "And if he fights back?" George lit a cigarette, exhaled through his nose. "Then we remind him who taught Philly to bleed." The next step was slow. George didn't leak the files. He let rumors breathe first. A whisper here. A line in a conversation at a cigar lounge in Fishtown. A quiet suggestion during a late lunch with a union rep Wexler thought he controlled. "I heard the councilman's been visiting properties in his wife's name." "Strange. I thought that account was closed last year. Maybe he's got friends he's not declaring." Within a week, George could feel it. The soft recoil. Wexler's name came up more. But not with respect. With curiosity. Doubt. He hadn't even fired a bullet, and already the floorboards were creaking under Wexler's shoes. Then George visited someone he hadn't seen in months. Anthony Cilieri, the DeLuca defector. Anthony had gone quiet after the farmhouse hit. George had granted him freedom, but kept eyes on him, just in case. Now, he needed him again. They met at a diner off I-95, in a booth where no one could hear the conversation unless they were trained to do it. Chilieri looked older, grayer, but calmer. "You said you didn't want back in," George said, sipping burnt coffee. "I don't," Chilieri replied, "but I figured this wasn't a social call." George slid a photo across the table. Wexler and a man in a suit getting into a black SUV. Chilieri studied it. "That's Jerome Clay," he said. "Runs an investment firm in Jersey, real quiet. Moves money for politicians who don't want their names in ink. DeLuca used him for land grabs." George leaned in. "You sure?" Chilieri nodded. "He only works with guys who think they're clean. That's his pitch." "I don't hide your money. I redirect it." George smirked. "Then let's redirect it somewhere useful." That night, George called in a favor. A hacker named Luca, who owed him from an old debt involving a stolen server and a missing cousin. George didn't ask questions. He just gave names. In 24 hours, Luca delivered bank accounts, digital trails, flight logs. All roads pointed back to Wexler and Clay, and one new name, Silas Troy, a senator's son, involved in a lobbying firm that consulted for the city, which meant federal money was now tangled in the mess. George looked over the files and felt something shift. This wasn't just politics. This was a network. And Wexler wasn't the spider. He was just another strand. Carlo met George the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a map of who was who in the city's real estate game. George pointed to 3 properties. 1, an unfinished high-rise downtown. 2, a waterfront parcel sold for pennies on the dollar. 3, a ghost building with no permits but a dozen investors, all connected to Wexler. "All funded through dummy firms," George said, "and all connected to Clay." Carlo nodded. "So we squeezed the funding?" George smiled faintly. "No. We collapse it." By the end of the week, a fake shell company George had quietly set up bought controlling interest in one of the investment firms tied to the high-rise. It only took $200,000. Not a lot, not when you knew the right pockets. 2 days after that, construction stopped. Not paused, stopped. Workers walked off, permits got flagged. The city inspector, a man who owed George a favor from 2002, declared the entire foundation unsafe. News spread. And now, Wexler's name was in ink. Front pages, not with accusations, with questions, which, to the public, were often worse. Wexler called. George didn't answer. He called again. Still nothing. On the 3rd try, George picked up, didn't speak, just listened. Wexler's voice was tight. "You've made your point." George was quiet. Wexler continued. "None of this ends well for you." George lit a cigarette, let the silence breathe, then said, "You came to me with threats dressed as offers. You called me a tool, a hammer for your politics." He exhaled smoke. "But I'm not the tool. I'm the fire." And hung up. That night, George stood at the window. Below, the city blinked and breathed like always. But something in the rhythm had changed. Wexler had made a move. George had answered. And now, everything was tilting, not toward blood, but toward a reckoning. Because George had touched the real machinery now, and he knew he'd need to break more than bones to win this time. The headline hit the papers at 6:03 a.m. "Councilman linked to crime syndicate. Anonymous sources point to George Borgesi dealings." The Inquirer ran it first, followed by 2 online blogs. Then, the evening news caught on. By sundown, the whole city was buzzing. Reporters outside City Hall, cameras at the courthouse, and a single image on repeat across every screen. George Borgesi, stepping out of the Federal Club. Dark coat, gloves, face unreadable. Wexler had made his move. He hadn't called again. He'd gone straight for public execution. George stood in the tailor shop that morning, the paper folded on the table in front of him. Carlo leaned on the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You knew this was coming," Carlo said. George didn't answer. He was reading the article line by line, like it was written in code. Names, timelines, phrases like unnamed sources, questionable alliances, organized influence on development permits. It was clean, surgical, not an indictment. Yet, but enough to spook every suit in a 50-mile radius, enough to blacken George's name without ever pulling a trigger. Carlo tapped the table. "You want me to start reaching out to press guys? We've got people who can—" George shook his head. "No." He folded the paper slowly, precisely, and set it aside. "If we deny it, we validate it." Carlo squinted. "Then what do we do?" George lit a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, slow and controlled. "We wait." Carlo frowned. "For what?" George looked out the window. "For him to slip." But the waiting wasn't easy. The silence began to shift, not just on the streets but inside the ranks. Some of George's own started asking questions, quiet ones. Carlo caught a runner talking to a guy from New York. A numbers man in South Jersey started holding back the cut. Small things. But George knew how fast small cracks became a fault line. He spent the next 3 days watching. No retaliation, no statements, just quiet steps. He visited the boxing gym in South Philly, where he used to train with Vin in the 90s. The old manager, Marco, still ran the place, still wrapped his hands the same way. They talked for an hour, mostly about nothing. But George dropped a line before he left. "If the city forgets who kept it clean, remind them who paid for the lights to stay on." Marco nodded. The next morning, a different kind of rumor started moving. On the streets, they said George wasn't denying the article because it wasn't worth his time. They said Wexler was running scared, throwing punches in the dark. A week later, a trash truck full of shredded paper got pulled over in Jersey. No one said much, but people whispered it was City Hall documents. George never commented, but the fear shifted, back toward him. Still, Wexler wasn't done. 2 days later, the councilman held a press conference. Sharp suit, clean tie, his voice calm but colder than usual. "We cannot allow corruption, of any kind, to shape this city's future. I have always stood for clean growth, for honor, for safety." He didn't name George. He didn't have to. The crowd heard the message loud and clear. That night, a reporter showed up outside the tailor shop. A young woman. Brave eyes. "Mr. Borgesi, do you have any response to Councilman Wexler's implications?" George looked at her from the door, smiled, and said only, "People who speak the truth don't usually need microphones." Then he closed the door. Back inside, Carlo stared. "You're handling this too quietly." George turned. "You think we should shoot a politician in broad daylight?" Carlo shook his head. "I think people need to see that the streets still answer to you." George stepped close, lowered his voice. "They will, but not with blood." Carlo blinked. George continued. "I've bled for this city, but if I kill Wexler now, I'll look like the man he's painting in those papers. This isn't about force anymore. It's about proof." That night, George went to see Luca again, the hacker. He brought a flash drive this time. "Everything?" Luca asked. "Everything," George said. On the drive were the files, not the ones from before. These were different. Audio. Clips recorded from a phone line Wexler once used to call Clay. Clips from the car ride after the federal club meeting. Even a voicemail he left for a fixer in Baltimore. "Take care of him if he doesn't bite. Quietly." George didn't smile. Just said, "Put it on a burner site. Bury it for now. Make it look like a leak from inside his circle." Luca nodded. "And when should I release it?" George looked out the window at the city skyline, all lit up like a crown over a grave. When he steps onto the stage. And he did. 10 days after the original article, Wexler announced his intent to run for mayor. He stood in front of cameras, hands raised, voice smooth, promising reform, order, transparency. He spoke George's name again, indirectly, talked about old systems being finally erased. George sat in the apartment, watching the feed with Carlo beside him. Luca sent a single text. "Ready?" George nodded. "Now." 30 minutes later, the clip leaked. First to a small blog, then to Reddit, then to 3 journalists George didn't control. It spread like fire on dry leaves. Wexler's voice, clear, cold. "I don't care what he's done. If he won't play nice, we'll sink him with the press. I want his name burning by next week." Another voice answered, And if that doesn't work? Wexler. Then we'll let Clay handle it. George Borgesi bleeds like the rest of them. The city exploded. Within hours, reporters were camped outside Wexler's office. Clay vanished, and whispers began. Not about George, but about who Wexler worked for. George didn't celebrate. He didn't raise a glass. He stood at the window as the city roared again, not in violence, but in confusion. In fear. Because when a politician falls, the people start asking who stood behind him, and now they were looking not at George, but past him, into the shadows he hadn't even explored yet. The next morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, no envelope, left under the shop door again. Just 6 words. You've made someone very nervous. No signature, no threats, just a warning. George held it for a long time, then tucked it into the notebook with Vin's old picture and Blackie's folded obituary. He knew what came next. This wasn't about a city anymore. This was about something bigger. And for the first time, George wondered if he was staring down the edge of something he couldn't climb back from. Because politics was louder than gunfire and more permanent than blood. The warehouse sat quiet on the far end of the Navy Yard, past the rusted ships and crumbling parking lots. It wasn't on any books, no cameras, no curious eyes, just metal and shadow. George arrived at midnight. Carlo waited in the car, engine running. George stepped out alone. Inside, the place smelled like old oil and dust. The overhead lights buzzed low, casting everything in a strange yellow haze. A table had been set up in the middle, 2 chairs, 1 bottle of water, no guards. The man was already sitting there, not Wexler, not Clay, not any face George recognized. But his presence said everything. Slim, clean-shaven, gray suit, dark eyes. He didn't stand when George entered, just motioned to the chair. Mr. Borgesi, he said. George didn't sit. You have a name? The man smiled. Some people call me Elliot. Some don't call me at all. George stared. You behind Wexler? I'm behind systems, the man replied. Wexler was a tool, sharp, useful, disposable. George stepped closer. So what are you? Elliot folded his hands. I'm the reason men like you get to rule cities, until you become inconvenient. The lights above hummed louder. George didn't blink. I'm not inconvenient, he said. You're dangerous, Elliot corrected. You unify things, that's useful, until it isn't. We prefer chaos. Chaos can be managed. George stepped forward slowly, calm. So you sent Wexler after me? No, Elliot said. I gave him a leash. He chose how far to run. You just happened to be in the way. And now? Elliot tilted his head. Now we have a problem. Silence stretched. Then George asked, Why not kill me? Elliot smiled faintly. Because your death would start 100 small fires. Your people would turn South Philly into a war zone again. Every kid with a gun would try to wear your crown. He leaned forward. But your retirement? That would leave a vacuum we could fill properly. George finally sat. You think I'm going to walk away? Elliot's voice was soft. I think you're tired, and I think you're smart enough to see the long game. He reached into a folder, pulled out a paper, pushed it across the table, a document, corporate charter, real estate, merged interests. At the top, Borgesi Development Group. Elliot tapped it. You step away, quietly. We give you a seat at the real table. No more crews, no more street blood. You become legitimate. George studied the paper. All the numbers made sense. The bribes were buried so deep it would take a year to find them. The names were all ghosts. It was clean. Too clean. Then he looked at Elliot. You think I care about buildings? Elliot's eyes didn't move. I think you care about Philadelphia, about seeing it stable, alive. You step out now, it keeps breathing. You stay in, the war starts again. We'll make sure of it. George exhaled. You don't sound like the feds. I'm not. CIA. No. George narrowed his eyes. Then who do you answer to? Elliot finally leaned back. Continuity. That's all you need to know. For the first time in years, George felt something old creeping in. Fear. Not the kind that makes you sweat, the kind that makes you aware. Aware that there were powers in the world that didn't speak with bullets or ballots, just with influence. And here he was, staring one in the face. He folded the paper, stood. Elliot didn't move. "You'll take the deal," he said. George lit a cigarette. "No," he said. Elliot blinked. "You'll destroy your own empire." George's voice was calm. "I'd rather burn it down myself than hand it to a ghost." He dropped the paper. Elliot didn't flinch, just said, "Then I hope your people survive what's coming." George turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You ever been shot?" he asked. Elliot smiled faintly. "No." George turned his head half a glance back. "Then don't talk to me like you understand sacrifice." And he walked out. Outside, Carlo looked up from the driver's seat. "Well," George got in, "we're not negotiating." Carlo drove, no music, no chatter, just the hum of the engine and the weight of what was coming. Over the next week, George began making moves, not to protect himself, to disarm everything. He started dissolving the shell companies. Sold off 3 fronts, burned ledgers, pulled his most loyal guys out of city contracts. It looked like surrender, but it was something else. Preservation. He wasn't going to let them use his empire. He'd dismantle it piece by piece, on his terms. Some guys panicked. They thought he was scared. Carlo made sure they didn't speak too loud. In South Philly, loyalty was a blade, and George still held it. He made one final visit to the cemetery. Vin's grave, still unmarked, just a patch of grass on the edge of a hill. George knelt, lit a cigarette. "I thought I could fix it all," he said. "Thought I could be the last one standing and it would feel like winning." He looked up at the sky, colorless, but it just feels like silence. He stayed there a long time. That night, he wrote 3 letters, one to Carlo, one to Angie at the bakery, one to nobody, just a note he folded and tucked into the drawer by the window. This city deserved better. Then, he disappeared. No funeral, no goodbyes, no body, just gone. Some say he went to Italy. Others say the suits finally got him. Carlo never talked, neither did the streets. And the city? It kept moving. New blood came, loud kids with louder dreams. But the old ones, they remembered the man who didn't sell the city, who walked away so they wouldn't have to kneel. And sometimes, when the wind moves a certain way near Passyunk Avenue, you can almost hear it. A voice, a whisper. George Borgesi didn't die a gangster. He died the last honest man in a crooked town.